and also Alexandra and Brooks. Great. So Abigail is also from the Athena Art Foundation. She's our digital manager. So Abigail is going to introduce Alexandra and Brooks in more detail. But thank you all for joining us and welcome, and we hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, it's incredibly exciting to be talking about this exhibition. And again, much like you, I am devastated that I am not able to be in America and view it. So our two guests today from the National Gallery of Art are Alexandra Libby, who is a Senior Administrator for Collections and Initiatives and the Acting Head and Curator of Northern European Paintings at the National Gallery of Art. During her 10 years at the museum, she has curated Water, Wind and Waves, marine paintings from the Dutch Golden Age in 2018, Vermeer's Secrets in 2022, and most recently, Little Beasts, Art Wonder and the Natural World this very year. She has also published and lectured widely on 17th century Dutch and Flemish painting, including contributions to exhibition and collection catalogues, volumes of collected essays, and scholarly journals. Prior to joining the National Gallery, she was Assistant Curator of European Art at the John Mabel Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota. She earned her PhD in the History of Art from the University of Maryland and her MA from Boston University and her BA from Colby College. Our other guest, Brooks Rich, is Associate Curator of Old Master and 19th Century Prints at the National Gallery of Art. Since arriving in Washington in 2019, he has curated the exhibitions The Renaissance in the North, New Prints and Perspectives in 2022, and Little Beasts, Art Wonder and the Natural World in 2025. He has previously held curatorial fellowships at the Rijksmuseum and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he worked at the Clark Art Institute and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Rich holds a PhD in the History of Art from the University of Pennsylvania, with a specialization in 16th century Netherlandish engraving. He also has an MA from Williams College and a BA from Bowdoin College. Apologies if that pronunciation was not perfect. So Alexandra, if you'd like to share our PowerPoint, and then would you both be happy to give us a quick overview of the exhibition and the origins of the project?
Absolutely. And I should mention that there's a third curator on the exhibition who couldn't join us today. Stacy Sell is a curator of Old Master Drawings at the gallery. So she will trust us to speak about the entire show in her absence. So the show is open till November 2nd at the National Gallery of Art's West Building, if you are able to make it to Washington. But happy to give you a little overview here of what you would encounter if you were able to come to the show. Alex, if you want to go to the next slide. We can see the entrance to the show. It's really an exhibition about the role of artists at the dawn of European natural history in the 16th and 17th centuries and the important role that artists played. We've been talking about this period as a kind of ecosystem of curiosity where artists and naturalists are exchanging images and specimens of both common and newly discovered or encountered animals that are coming in from around the world through colonial expansion and expeditions. And also the role that collectors play in accumulating both these specimens and also these works of art. So this ecosystem between these three groups. Our show is organized chronologically, beginning in the 16th century, moving into the 17th century, with works of art from our permanent collection that are anchors for the show. Although we have a few loans from local institutions, we tried to be ecologically responsible for a show about the natural world and tried to focus mainly on masterpieces from our collection. The first gallery, if you could just go back very quickly, Alex. The first gallery focuses on Joris Hoefnagel, and you can see a case right at the center of the gallery through the door. 4 volumes from our collection by Joris Hoefnagel, Antwerp-born artist who worked in courts throughout Europe, and contain 270 watercolors that gather the natural world for his own personal study. They're really rarely exhibited masterpieces from our collection. And so that was one of the kind of driving forces behind the show, is to have a chance to exhibit these to the public. The second gallery moves into the later 16th and 17th centuries and the role that printmaking plays in allowing little beasts to multiply and crawl out into the world. And then the third space, the blue gallery you can see at the bottom there, focuses on 17th century Antwerp painter Jan van Kessel, who specializes in the depiction of animals, in particular insects. And the title of the show, Little Beasts, tells you that the show is about the animal world. It's about the natural world broadly, but focuses on the animal world. Little Beasts being a literal translation of the Dutch term beestje, for bug. So we really focused on animals, works from our collection, and attempted in as many cases as possible to zoom in, look closely, encourage people to look closely at frequently very small works of art through a lot of different kind of strategies. The main strategy was partnering with our neighbors at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, right next to us on the National Mall in Washington, to borrow specimens and taxidermy to have in conversation with the works of art, trying to kind of mirror the exchange between artists and naturalists that happened in the early modern period, and work with our colleagues, scientists here, to do the same kind of work. We also have touch screens that are in each of the galleries. Here you can see another kind of comparison where the natural history curators, collections managers were able to create a kind of vignette that that reproduces a work by Jan van Kessel in the third space. We have touch screens in each of the galleries that allow people to follow kind of alternate stories and zoom in more closely. We have those specimen and taxidermy loans. And then cases that explore artists, specifically Hoofnagel's materials and techniques, to understand how an artist was able to accomplish this kind of incredible detail. And then fun graphics that we hope will encourage people to think about scale, zooming in, zooming out. It's a show that's full of works of art that are serious but playful, and so the installation has a kind of playful quality. And then finally, there's a fourth gallery that we'll get to a little bit later on. The final room in the show, it projects forward. It's a commissioned film by a contemporary artist named Dario Robleto, who works at the intersection of art and science. And it offers a kind of coda to the show that thinks about the work that our conservators and conservation scientists at the National Gallery do, and the way that their care for our collection kind of mirrors the empathy that he sees in the works of art, and the care that they take in representing these animals, sometimes for the first time. So that's a kind of overview for the show. I can pass it on to you, Nicola, for maybe to begin the questions, unless Alex has something that she wanted to say.
No, just
Okay.
thank you for doing that, Brooks. And I've been sort of just thumbing through some of the images that we provided, and for the audience, we'll go back to some of these as well, but just so that you have a flavor for what the show looks like.
Well, it looks absolutely wonderful to me. I mean, I've always been really fascinated by Hoofnagel because my specialization is Spain, and he did go to Spain, and there is the most wonderful painting in, I think it's now in Brussels, of a view of Seville that he paints, which is just fantastic, which has got natural history, it's got mythology, it's got a scene of Seville. And I've always wondered, I'd wanted to know more about Hoofnagel. So when I saw this show, I thought, and then all of this was just completely new to me. So so thank you. I want to touch on something as the first question that Brooks mentioned, is the collaboration with the Smithsonian, with the National Museum of Natural History. I mean, has that brought in a new audience? Because one of the things that we're very interested in at the Athena Art Foundation is how you encourage more people to come in and look at pre-modern art of all kinds. And I wonder whether, I mean, clearly there's a lot of interest in science, but it's not necessarily the same people who would be interested in art, although they might be interested in diagrams, mightn't they, in illustrations. So I just wondered if you could speak about that a little bit.
One of the fun things about the natural history and the NGA specifically is that we're next door neighbors on the National Mall here. So the National Gallery itself is not a Smithsonian, but like the Smithsonians, we are all offer free entrance. So anybody can come in. And so what we find is that because we share this border, we actually share a lot of the same visitorship. We've done a lot to cross promote the two, well, the exhibition here and then to promote the Natural History Museum just next door to us. We've had tremendous visitorship. We've reached over 100,000 people so far in 3 months, which is really wonderful. But more importantly, we have been doing visitor surveys that say people are really enjoying it. So it's not just that they're coming in and checking it out and leaving, but that they're staying. And I think one will find that for the most part, people who wander into an art museum don't necessarily identify as art people. We find that a lot. You walk up to someone and you say, "Excuse me, can I ask you questions?" And they go, "Oh, I'm not an art person." So in terms of new audiences, I think this is a show that is just capturing audiences generally. It's not that more science people have come than before, or more art people might be going over to natural history, but really what we're showing is just the excitement and the beauty that exists, and through word of mouth, it's really spread. So I don't think it's specifically science people, but we're also finding a lot younger audiences are coming, especially children. Brooks and I both have kids. And for me, I guess I should only speak for myself. It's been such a joy taking my children, who are 8 and 11, through this, because the comparison with the natural history and the art, it does exactly what we want it to. It really encourages you to look closely and go between the two and say, "Oh, did they get that right? Oh, look at how he does that color." Oh, so it's really delightful show, I think, for everyone, if I can say so. But Brooks,
Yeah, I would just add, we've given a lot of tours of the exhibition, and we've given a tremendous number of tours to professionals and donor groups and enthusiasts from other Smithsonian institutions, including the Natural History Museum. So I think the excitement at Natural History around the show, I think, has probably led to some new groups that might not have prioritized coming here. So that collaboration, I think, has been really fruitful. And to see the natural history staff come over and come through to show off their part of the collaboration has been really gratifying.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about the children, because I was going to ask you that follow-up question. I can imagine for teachers it would be a great exhibition too, because it's a way of getting kids to look really in detail, as you say. And I love that comparison that you showed with the sprig of rosemary and the ladybirds, or ladybugs you call them. It's so cool that you've got them exactly the same there. Yeah,
I mean,
lovely.
it's funny because we've had a couple of people say, "Oh, children must love this show," and it's true, but adults do as well. I mean, it's not, of course, mutually exclusive. But what we're finding is that the same things that delight young audiences delight the older ones as well. Everybody loves a little bit of surprise. Everybody likes a hint of of delight, of fun, and this show is really meant to show that art and science are fun. There's a ton of intellectual rigor that undergirds all of the work of these artists at the time and these naturalists at the time. And also, we have artists who are deliberately trying to engage you with fun tricks, with little insects that might not exist in real life, with playful elements. I'm thinking, for example, and I don't have a real close-up of it, but if you look in the one of the right-hand columns, you can see that Jan van Kessel signed his name in snakes and worms and caterpillars. So, even he is enjoying this material in a way.
Wow, that's brilliant. I just noticed which this is the bottom right corner, isn't it? One in with the
My
snake.
pointer is showing up for you all, but this one right here.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think it's so nice. It really, the combination of the National Gallery of Art and the Natural Museum of History, it's such an effective collaboration for this exhibition as well, where these two disciplines of art and science are not separate at all in this. It's quite a modern and
Exactly.
artificial, even I love art history because it is such an interdisciplinary subject, but there's still that very strong separation, and it feels so artificial to think of art and science as entwined, but when you look at these works, it's so natural. And I also wanted to touch on how a lot of these works are really very, very fragile. So can you talk a bit more about the contribution of the scientists at your two institutions and conservators into the materiality of these really intricate works?
Yeah, one really good example of the collaboration internally between us as curators and our conservators and conservation scientists is in the first gallery, focusing on the volume that depicts insects by Joris Hoefnagel, and this is a very famous volume that has been studied before, but zooming in with conservators under microscopes, doing material testings, there were some really wonderful new discoveries that were made. It's always been acknowledged, or been acknowledged for a long time, that Hoefnagel pasted in dragonfly wings on several of the pages. The image you see on the right, the bodies of those dragonflies are painted, the shadows are painted, but for the dragonflies on the bottom, the wings are pasted in, actual 16th century dragonfly wings. And zooming in, we realized that the wings had begun to flake off even in Hoefnagel's own lifetime. And you can see on the left the way that he went in with a brush and filled in the gaps so that you couldn't tell the difference between organic matter and the artist's hand. And that's part of the kind of joke and endeavor here. The top dragonfly is completely painted, and Hoefnagel in the moment would have wanted you to struggle with which one was real, which was not, which is the product of man's creation and which is the product of God's creation. So working with conservators to zoom in and study this really helped to inform the project. Alex, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's been, and what you're looking at here is another photomicrograph zoomed in of an example of, oh God, Brooks, is it lepidochrome or lepidochrome? Lepidochrome. I always forget how to say it, which is, in the first example Brooks was showing you, he pasted in dragonfly wings. In this example, what we're looking at is printing with butterfly scales. So if you've ever touched a butterfly or maybe even squished a moth, it gets kind of dusty on your fingers. And so what Hoefnagel did was he applied an adhesive to the paper, and then he pushed the butterfly or moth wings in and then peeled them up. And behind what was left, that residue, is their scales. And so what you're seeing here in this photomicrograph, again, are 16th century scales of a butterfly. So in the same way, he's inviting you to see what is his creation, what is God's creation. Can you tell the difference, and who did it best?
And in this case, he would add watercolor to fill in the gaps and round out the form of the butterfly or moth. But
and the body, we should say, they took off the bodies because if you press that down, it would get pretty messy.
Yeah. And so for this volume, the volume, I should have mentioned that Hoefnagel's 4 elements are called the 4 elements because the watercolors are divided up according to the classical elements: land, air, water, and fire, with animals that relate to each of those elements. So water animals in water, flying animals in air, and fire or Ignis is where he collects his studies of insects. And there are no entomological treatises that predate this volume that he made in the 1570s, 80s, early 90s. So he's looking directly at real insects and doing his best to capture things like iridescence and the texture of moths and butterflies and dragonflies. And so he's pioneering these new techniques, including this lepidochrome, in order to get as close to the real thing at its real scale as he can. And this is a technique that gets used later by naturalists in the 18th, 19th centuries. But to our knowledge, this is the earliest example of lepidochrome that survives. And the extent, and the extent of it really is only revealed through technical analysis with conservators. Just quickly to answer the other part of the question, what was the role of scientists at natural history? I think when we started the show, we knew we wanted to try and borrow specimens to have in conversation, but we weren't sure whether it would happen. We were optimistic that if we reached out to Smithsonian Natural History, that they would be interested in collaborating. But in many cases, we have images that were never given a species name or identified specifically in art historical records. So we're going to scientists at Natural History saying, can you help us identify this animal, and do you have one to lend? And we're talking about insects alone, they have 40 million specimens. So it was a really fruitful back and forth. We learned so much from them. One example of this print by Jakob Hoefnagel, Joris Hoefnagel's son. You can see just at the top, there's a watercolor by Joris Hoefnagel. That's the source for the print. And that creature at the top was always described as by art historians as an imaginary crustacean. And working with Natural History, they saw that image, and the collection manager for invertebrate zoology immediately said, it's a chimera, it's a made-up creature, but it's not imaginary. It's the head and the tail of a mantis shrimp. So is Hoefnagel working from a broken specimen, or is he doing something akin to what he does with the dragonflies? Is he trying to show his own powers of creativity, to test his audience, to see if they know that it's not a real animal? There's a whole bunch of ambiguity there that gets into the kind of gray area between art and science that's driving this in the 16th century.
Just to slightly touch on that even further, it does feel like, the third word in your title being wonder, kind of encompasses the sort of the quasi-religious and spiritual parts of it that were involved in these really detailed, and they seem almost quite like brutal, perhaps just being a 21st century vegetarian, the idea of using actual creatures to do that. But there's such like attention to detail and focus in it that that the wonder really kind of shines through. And
Yeah.
I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the, how that was reconciled by artists like Hofnagel at the time.
Well, at the time, there's, talk about the book of nature, and you need to know the book of nature to understand God and God's power and bounty and, munificence. So they are very deeply tied in this moment. For these specific artists, we're not making any claims about them specifically, but certainly, and when you look at early treaties, and in the Hoefnagel volumes as well, there are biblical passages, there are citations, there's all of the associations that can be collected with these animals having to do with the religious and the spiritual, or sort of disarmingly in some of the early encomia, like what they taste like, or what their medicinal purposes might be. So it's the separation, I think, isn't there at the time as we might consider it today. I don't know, Brooks, do you want to add on to that?
No, just to your point, Abigail, there is a meditative quality in the intense focus on these animals and the desire to depict them as accurately as possible for Hoefnagel and for Van Kessel. And these are watercolors that are postcard size, just incredible even at magnification. So I think there's a spiritual quality to that kind of attention and reverence for the natural world too.
Yeah, certainly in the Hoefnagels, I think, especially as, I think the word meditative is a really nice one, because as Brooke said at the outset, this were really for him. This was his own private paper zoo. And then it later becomes part of collections, and then, enters the market and eventually comes to the National Gallery of Art. But he did these for himself. In the work of Jan van Kessel, or even Jakob Hoefnagel, these are for a market. And this is for, a commercial market. I'll move to this one with Van Kessel, for example. These are also about postcard size. They're all oil paintings on copper, and they would have been the fronts of doors and drawers of a collector's cabinet. So you would open these drawers and look inside, and there might be a feather or a shell or a butterfly or, amber, or, any of these sort of treasures from around the world that were being collected at this time. Or the doors, you just sort of open them up. So whether or not these particularly had that same meditative, devotional quality, I'm not sure. but certainly they nevertheless fill you with wonder. And I like to think the Van Kessel had no interest in you opening the doors and the drawers of these cabinets to look inside, but instead wanted you to just admire their outsides.
Thank you so much. It's such an incredible corpus of works to have on display together. I'm sure Nicola probably has more to say on all of this.
Yeah, no, I'm super interested in sort of the ideas about natural history and about this period when there has been sort of an idea that God was, that this was very much the book of nature. It was and in fact some of the religious reformers, I believe Luther, really believed that the book of nature was where you actually could see God's bounty very much, and that was that was an idea that was circulating, although I think Hufnagel was Calvinist, wasn't he? So same sort of general world, I suppose, but maybe slightly different. But in fact, sometimes it seems a little bit hubristic to me, like the bit where he puts the two together and see if you spot it, I mean, is that putting himself in the role of the creator? Slightly dangerous idea, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
and in the print series that that lies at the heart of the second gallery, where Hufnagel's recognizing that there's a broader interest in especially these insects that he's depicting in watercolor, and uses printmaking in order to multiply and share these images with a wider audience. There are many references in that volume that kind of conflate the artist and God, and play with this idea of reproduction as a means of preservation and a way to act against the ephemerality of the natural world. So I think there's a really interesting tension there, that we explore a bit in the show.
oh, that's fascinating. I mean, I was also very interested in the fact that many of the artists, well, the two artists in question both come from Antwerp. So this sort of very important commercial center that's a place where it's Protestant, it's not Catholic anymore, but in this period it's sort of beginning to separate from to revolt against the Spanish Catholics. I mean, and it's also a center of great, they're making interesting optical devices and things, aren't they, in this area? I mean, can you speak a little bit more about Antwerp and why it was such an important center for all of this?
Sure. Well, Antwerp actually remains Catholic at
Oh,
this.
does it? Mm-hmm. Right.
And it is, for a long time, one of the, if not the, Antwerp and Amsterdam, Amsterdam ultimately overtakes it, but is the massive port in Northern Europe. And there, through the Habsburg dynastic connections to the Spanish Habsburg connections to Portugal, they become just embedded in global trade. So they have ships coming from Japan and Indonesia and, East Africa, West Africa, Brazil, North America, and bringing with them the shells and the species and the raw materials, ebony, and they're trading in enslaved people. They're very much part of the transatlantic slave trade. So this port, and there's a great early, or I guess mid-16th century quote that talks about Antwerp as the port of the universe, becomes just a rich resource for these artists. It's also a center of book publishing and printmaking. Certainly by the time of Van Kessel, Hufnagel, Brooks can speak to the Hufnagels, physical journeys across Northern Europe. Joris Hufnagel is from there, but during the Spanish sack of Antwerp, he is forced out, and his livelihood is ruined. He started as a luxury merchant. He was not until his 30s or so,
Yeah.
an artist. But he's highly trained. He's been to Paris. He's he's a very learned individual anyway. But I don't know. Maybe you want to talk about that, because the court culture is also a really important tie here as well.
Yeah, when Hufnagel, when the sack of Rome displaces him and he leaves Antwerp, that's really where his career as an artist takes off. And it's because of his watercolors of animals that he's carrying with him that he's noticed by the court in Munich and is made a court artist, which gives him the opportunity to really focus on this project. But as an Antwerp artist, he's familiar with other Antwerp artists and printmakers, especially, who are making paper zoos at the end of the 16th century. And part of what gets him acknowledged, internationally outside of the courts is his engagement with engraving as a means of reproducing his watercolors in the form of print series. So the second gallery really digs into print culture and the efforts for printmakers to move beyond woodcut treatises that focus on animals, and produce fine print series that make animals the primary subject separate from text. And that's something that is happening in Antwerp, and there's a growing market. I think Van Kessel reflects the 17th century lineage of that growing market for animal-focused art.
That's right. Van Kessel is the grandson of Jan Bruegel the Elder, one of the most famous 17th century painters, famous collaborator with Rubens. And Van Kessel really takes up that kind of birthright, that artistic birthright, and follows in the family footsteps, but ends up specializing more than Jan Bruegel, but he's such a vast and beautiful oeuvre that also includes many beautiful flower still lives and allegorical scenes. Van Kessel does those as well, but he really becomes best known for these little paintings on copper that were ordered by cabinet makers. That said, he is someone who is also very much keyed in to, and I'll show you this image. There's one at the bottom with just, I don't know, 7 snakes or so, all sort of coiled up and curled and around. Every single one of those comes from a Rubens painting, the head of Medusa. So he too is really keyed in to a specific Antwerp moment and to Antwerp artists, his grandfather's famous collaborator, in addition to making his own way and doing things.
And is there, sorry, I just want to ask, so I mentioned optics. Were they interested, because they must have been using magnifying glasses, and I think in that area people were working on these things, or was that more in Holland? I mean, was it coming to Antwerp in this period?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first compound microscope isn't until the late 17th century, so post-dating all of these artists, but certainly lenses were available, and because of the elite circles in which these artists traveled, they would have had access to those, because those are really they're not commercialized yet, but there are documented spectacle makers in Italy in the 16th century and sort of those moving around, so they had to have magnification. We don't know what specifically, but yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we've slightly touched on this as we spoke about how Antwerp is a big centre of printmaking, and prints do feature really prominently in this exhibition. So could you tell us a little bit more about the role that printmaking played in this period where natural history is just being birthed too?
Yeah. And
Here.
I mentioned that there are illustrated treatises in the 16th century that are available and are sources for Hoofnagel, gathering, as Alex said, together information, not only behavior of animals, but also what they taste like, how they've been referred to in classical literature. And Hoofnagel and other artists are drawing on those woodcuts that are made in collaboration with naturalists as sources. I focus in the show a little bit more on these fine print series that take watercolors by artists like Hans Boll and Hoofnagel and reproduce them as kind of high definition images of animals for art collectors and for naturalists alike. So, an example here with a watercolor by Hans Boll that's translated into a print by Adrian Collart. One print in a series of, I think, 40 images of living birds, where you can see that it's likely that this watercolor is based on a dead specimen of a hoopoe with its wing lifted to emulate flight. There's this real desire to depict animals as if they're living, even if they're based on studies of taxidermy, studies of dead specimens. But the liveliness is really part of the artistic interest in them. And I think this print by Collart is really interesting because you have the landscape, which is a very traditional Netherlandish print subject that is still there, but it's in the background. The animals are really the primary focus, and there's no text that tells you anything about these animals. It's really the forms that are of the primary interest. And then the other thread of printmaking in the show is how natural history collectors and enthusiasts realize that printmaking, in this case, etching on the right, is a way to document private collections and share them with other enthusiasts. This is not artist-driven, but collector-driven printmaking. The print on the right is from a series of, we have 15 of the impressions from a series of, I think, 21 prints that document a private skeleton collection in Rome that was owned by the secretary of the Academy of the Lynx Eye, this kind of proto-scientific group that included Galileo. It's where Galileo debuted his own version of the microscope. And at about that time in 1620, the collector appears to have commissioned a series of prints documenting articulated skeletons. Here you have a bat kind of hovering in the air, and there are Latin inscriptions that playfully talk about the behavior of these animals, their deadness. So here the text says something about, I am neither a mouse nor a bird. I'm wonderfully ambiguous. I fly at night. So it kind of hints at identifying the creature, but it's a way for the owner of the skeleton to share images with a broader group, and you get a sense of this gray area between the scientific documentation, the work of the artist, and the playfulness that kind of bridges the gap. So the show really touches on both of those motivations, the collector motivation, the artist's motivation in using printmaking, and the fact that these fine prints are appearing on the market in the late 16th and 17th centuries in parallel with natural history texts that are starting to move in the direction that we think of as the science of natural history that we're familiar with today.
Thank you so much for the in-depth topics that we've covered here. And I think if people can begin to start putting their questions into the Q&A box, that would be great. Because just before we begin addressing your questions, there is, of course, the final room in the exhibition with Dario Robleto's contemporary film, which we can briefly touch upon. Yes, thank you.
Alex,
Sure.
do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah. So when we started working on this exhibition, we knew that we wanted to, well, I'll start by saying it was always a dream to work with the Natural History Museum because of how important artists and naturalists are together to the dissemination of knowledge at this time, and how we really wanted to model that and that continued sense of learning with the art historians and the natural historians, as the artists and the naturalists were, 400 years ago. And what we saw too was that there's so many artists today that are continuing that tradition, who are still interested very deeply in the connection between art and science, especially at a time when sort of STEM and arts feel like they're being pulled apart. And so the artist Dario Robleto, who is based in Texas, was a natural choice for us to invite to work with us, and we're so pleased that he said yes. He's a photographer, a printmaker, a sculptor, and most recently a filmmaker. We commissioned from him a film. The title is Until We Are Forged, Hymns for the Elements. And this film really draws parallels between the meticulous attention artists paid to their animal subjects and then this sense, and Brooks talked about this a little at the beginning, the tender and empathetic care that NGA conservators and scientists extend to our collections to safeguard them for future generations. I'll just go through a couple of the stills. You'll have to come to see it. But really what he sees in the work of scientists, and he's worked with cardiologists, he's worked with astronomers, he sees in all of the work the idea of empathy and how we care for each other, and that artists in the 16th century, cardiologists today, conservators today are all, it's the element of care that drives them to do the work that they do in order to advance humanity, in order to create connections within, us all. So we so enjoyed working with him. He was an absolute delight. And here you're looking at a still from the film of some of our conservation scientists and conservators. We've got both sets here at the National Gallery. We're very lucky. And this is doing some of the non-invasive imaging work that helps us understand pigments and materiality and technique.
The film is, we imagined it as a kind of coda to the show, but you must exit back through the exhibition. So it's a great opportunity, a kind of hinge for you to dive into the materiality of the objects. And Dario is very poetic, so some philosophical musings about the work of these artists and conservators and the universe. And then as you exit the show, hopefully it helps you to look at the works of art a little bit differently. For me, as one of the curators of the show, it's led to some further acknowledgement of the similar roles that are played by the scientists and conservators at Natural History as well. The specimens and taxidermy that they lent to us, we treated exactly the same as we would any other works of art that we borrowed for the show. They were condition reported, they had insurance values, they were crated carefully to go just across the mall, and we will return them in the same state that we borrowed them, because these are scientific specimens that have ongoing scientific value, DNA testing and other kinds of scientific examination that can tell us more about these species, the change in their habitat, the change in their diet. So it's been really revelatory that to see the parallels between what we do with art in this building and what natural history scientists do just across the mall.
It's really lovely to have a film at the end of your exhibition that brings to light some of this really focused, a lot of the same themes as the exhibition, of course, but the work of scientists and conservators that often is the somewhat invisible work behind the things we experience every day. And then it's obviously such a huge part of the themes of the exhibition that then making it a focus of this film is.
Yeah, it's really a love letter to conservation, and it's been really meaningful to conservators who have seen it and been a part of it. So that's been really gratifying to see as well.
I don't think we have any questions open. I can't see any. Ah, yes, there is one here. Before I ask that, can I just ask a follow-up to the question that you've just been talking about? Were the scientists from the natural history side, were they surprised to see any of the work of the images? I mean, were there any images they didn't? I know they have 40 million, so it's difficult, but could any of these works be used to identify species which are which have disappeared or which have changed in some way, in terms of habitat or anything like that?
We did not find that to be the case with this exhibition. Although one of the really fun things was sort of watching the entomologist labor over what kind of swallowtail we were looking at. Was it a British swallowtail? Was it like a Irish swallowtail? I can't remember exactly how it went back and forth and back and forth. It was mostly in Brooks's room about this one. Like, did we get the right swallowtail? But for the most part, they were so accurate that they could identify them down to the species level. So when we were looking at.
Yeah, it created some interesting tension where, with this Van Kessel panel, the insects are rendered so accurately with such close looking that Lloyd Shockley, the entomologist, collection manager, was able to identify all of the species just from the image, and was able to go into their collection and lend us examples. And in other cases, we would present an image of, say, a skeleton, and the collection manager would say, well, that doesn't correspond with any real skeleton. There are bones missing. That bone is too long. And we actually went into storage at Natural History comparing porcupine skeletons and skulls to say, could this be a porcupine or is it a ground sloth? And the reality is that artists make mistakes, and we don't know if that skeleton was complete in its form in the collection at the time. So there's this kind of separation between art and science that was interesting to walk through with the collection managers. They told us so many things about the way that an artist might have been looking at a specimen versus a living creature in depicting some of these animals. And I think that we helped them in some ways to understand that there's creative revision involved and artistic decision making. It's not a
Yeah.
photograph of a skeleton; it's a print of a skeleton.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. This yellow butterfly you're looking at right here, Floyd said, "Oh, well, they were obviously working from a dead specimen." I said, "Oh," he said, "Well, that's the male and the female wing. So probably they had a dead specimen that became a couple of dead specimens that became associated, and the artist just pinned it back together accidentally using both a male and a female wing, for example." But it was wonderful too, because there was, I mean, as Brooke said, there were so similarities when we said, we'd like to borrow these. They said, well, we need to insure them, and we have certain light conditions, and we have certain, we said, oh, we do that too. But we didn't work with a single curator there. We worked with their collection managers, who are all PhDs in their area of specialization. Floyd has his doctorate is in Central American beetles. But they said to us early on, you think of us as a museum, but we're really a research institution that happens to have a museum attached to it. And so that was really, it was a real moment of reframing for me anyway, to think about how they use their collections. As Brooke said, this is about research. This is about habitat study. This is about ecology. This is not about the presentation that visitor, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million visitors a year see on the mall. It's so much more than that. So it really is, as Brooke said, a special honor to be able to borrow these and to know that, that buff-tailed bumblebee will go back into storage and perhaps be sent off to a research lab across the world one day, so that they understand, the buff-tailed bumblebee habitat from 1998 or whenever it was collected.
That's so interesting. You mentioned something there that has brought back a question that dawned on me while we were talking. You mentioned the collections manager or specialist in North American beetles, and we haven't really spoken at all about what is the geographical breadth of where these different specimens and studies from them. What does that cover? Obviously, at this period, there's a lot of colonial and imperial expansions going on, and we know that there are, for example, Durer's famous print of a rhinoceros. He'd never seen one, but he was still, well, probably had not seen one. So yeah, it was just making me curious about how far and wide are these animals actually from?
Yeah, that's a good question. Broadly, the exhibition covers the globe. As Brooke said, there had been no entomological treaties at the time that Hoofnagel was working. And so he is really working from life, or dead life, as the case may be at times. It's a lot of European species. Therefore, he is receiving things from elsewhere. By the time you're with Van Kessel, you see many more foreign to Antwerp species coming into his insect work. But there's a peacock in the exhibition, there's an armadillo in the exhibition, and a Mexican stag beetle.
Yeah, elephant beetle.
Elephant beetle.
That is one of the species that Hoofnagel likely only had access to because of his position at court, where an insect from Central America might have come back through an expedition. Yeah, and in the Jan van Kessel paintings, where there's more access in the 17th century to a larger number of international insects coming in from around the world, you get really great kind of juxtapositions. The central panel there, which is the largest, has a fire salamander that is a copy directly from Rubens, adjacent to an insect that is completely made up, that is drawn from a 16th century woodcut of a locust, next to insects that seem too strange to be real, but that are actually South American peanut-headed lantern moths and Hercules beetles. So there's this real playfulness that is drawing on the fact that there are international species now part of the lexicon of collectors. So there's some games going on, but also in a single cabinet like this, the ability to kind of gather and own images of insects from around the world.
And I will say,
Abigail,
which is not
sorry.
to negate the invertebrate species as well. So the shells that we have are from all over the world that are also in the show.
Abigail, I think we should maybe read out the questions from the audience.
Yes, we're just slowly running out of time now, aren't we?
Yeah.
Shall I take the first one?
Yeah, sure.
So a question from Achu has asked, might these books have also been made not only for collectors and producers' own benefit, but also for subsequent following artists to use in their pictures as reference and to copy, similar to Renaissance ideas of teaching, and also to later artists who include very detailed naturalistic insects in as a little trick?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that, for Hoofnagel's prints that are being made in Antwerp and throughout Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, one of the primary audiences for prints, the primary collectors of prints, are other artists who use them as sources. And Hoofnagel's prints are copied and made into to kind of model books for artists in all different media to use and reuse. So that's really an astute question. Yeah, artists are one of the primary audiences.
And the bound volume of his that he creates is called Archetypes and Studies. So very much in order to.
Brilliant. And then the next question we had was to ask whether these records of natural phenomenon relate to the work of humanists like Paracelsus, who were still relating plant-based medicines from the microcosm to the macrocosm and believed that certain flowers could be used to cure a person. They also asked whether this was the beginnings of a language of flower, which might have slowly evolved from such collections. Two very different ideas in a question to address there, I suppose.
Yeah, there's certainly a knowledge of the Hoofnagel had a knowledge of treatises focused on plants and uses them as sources for the four elements watercolors. And then in the Archetypes and Studies, his print series from 1592, you can see down at the bottom left corner the way that he's incorporating cut flowers. And this is really an inspiration to the pioneers of floral still life painting at the beginning of the 17th century as well. I don't think that fully answered the question. There's an awareness and an engagement with botanical treatises.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of unsatisfactory answer to that question is that this is really a show that's about the fauna and not the flora so much. It would have been a much bigger show, which also, Brooks mentioned at the top of this talk, is that we really tried to stay local collections in the spirit of sort of eco-consciousness. This would have been a very different exhibition if we had borrowed from Antwerp and from California and from London. So the story that we're telling is really sort of specific to the works that we have and that we've borrowed locally, to flesh out just this relationship between artists and naturalists as it pertains to the little beasts, the audacious.
We're
I
fortunate
think-
to have works that really are great centerpieces for case studies. And that's really what this show offers.
I think the questioner has thanked you very much for the answers. Perhaps we should tell them there's a fantastic catalogue as well,
Yes.
which you from Princeton,
Yes, thank you.
Princeton Press. So
Yeah.
and there's more information. I very much enjoyed reading that. I think
thank
it's time to wrap up because I know Alexandra has another meeting. So I just want to really thank the panelists so much for Brooks and Alexandra for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And yes, we will be, it's been recorded by the Association for Art History, and we're going to post it on Athena's YouTube channel, hopefully within the next week or so. So you will be able to see everything there again. And there is also a lovely website, as I think Abigail pointed out to one questioner, where you can see a lot more images. So so do look at that as well. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to everybody who's joined us today. And thanks to Abigail. And yeah, thank you to the Association for Art History. And lovely to see you. We hope that we'll be back next year with something completely different, but maybe with the NGA again. Who knows?
We'd love that. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much
for
for
having
inviting
us.
us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.